Top 8 states where it's impossible to live in a tiny home and why. Imagine building your dream home, cozy, efficient, debt-free, only to find out you can't legally live in it. Not because it's unsafe, not because it's poorly built, but because it's too small. Sounds absurd, right? Yet, across the United States, there are states where tiny home living is practically impossible, not due to lack of demand or interest, but because of outdated zoning laws, strict building codes, and local governments that simply haven't caught up with the modern movement toward downsizing. While tiny homes are becoming a symbol of freedom, sustainability, and minimalism, in these 8 states, they're often treated like law-breaking outsiders. Today, we're uncovering the real reasons why living small can become a big problem. And if your state's on this list, well, you might want to keep your home on wheels. Alaska. You'd think Alaska, with all its open land and off-grid living enthusiasts, would be a haven for tiny homes. But think again. The state is infamous for its fragmented zoning laws, which vary wildly from one borough to another. Many rural areas don't even have formal zoning in place, making it nearly impossible to gain permits for a tiny home that's not built on a full foundation. Worse yet, most municipalities classify tiny homes on wheels as recreational vehicles, meaning they're illegal for full-time living. Factor in the harsh winters, infrastructure challenges, and lack of tiny home-friendly developments, and Alaska becomes a cold reality check for anyone hoping to live large in a small space. Iowa. If you're dreaming of a simple, tiny lifestyle in the heartland, Iowa might break your heart. The issue isn't that the state openly bans tiny homes, it's that the rules quietly push them out. Most cities and counties enforce minimum dwelling sizes that are well above the average square footage of a tiny home, and any attempt to go mobile quickly triggers RV and mobile home classifications, which carry their own pile of restrictions. The state offers little to no framework for treating tiny homes as permanent dwellings, and without that legal recognition, insurance, utilities, and land use all become headaches. In short, Iowa has plenty of land, but no legal room for small-scale living. Louisiana. Tiny living in Louisiana faces an uphill battle, and not just because of the humidity. The state has some of the most convoluted and outdated zoning ordinances in the country, especially when it comes to alternative housing models. In many parishes, tiny homes are outright banned or treated as RVs, making them illegal to live in full-time. Even when local jurisdictions seem open-minded, there's no consistent building code framework for tiny homes, which means approvals depend on who's reviewing your application. Flood zones add yet another complication, often requiring permanent foundations that tiny homes simply aren't designed for. So while the culture might be laid back, the housing codes are anything but. North Dakota. Despite its wide-open spaces and affordable land, North Dakota remains surprisingly hostile to tiny home living. One major reason is the state's insistence on classifying tiny homes on wheels as RVs, which automatically disqualifies them from full-time residential use in most jurisdictions. Even site-built tiny homes struggle to meet minimum square footage requirements, which often exceed 900 square feet. Local governments rarely make exceptions, and without established building codes for small dwellings, approval becomes a tedious and often fruitless process. So if you're thinking of starting your minimalist lifestyle in the Peace Garden state, be prepared for a paper war, and potentially a no. New Jersey. Tiny homes and New Jersey don't mix, and not just because land prices are sky-high. Across the state, zoning laws typically require minimum home sizes between 800 to 1,000 square feet, which wipes out most tiny homes from consideration. Even mobile or modular units face extreme limitations, often confined to designated trailer parks, which are few, outdated, and burdened with regulations of their own. And don't think going off-grid is an option either. The state enforces utility connection requirements that make independence almost impossible. In essence, New Jersey is built on the idea that more square footage equals better living, and anyone who dares to shrink that standard is met with a wall of resistance. New York. You might think New York, especially New York City with its famously tiny apartments, would be a natural fit for tiny homes, but the reality couldn't be more different. The state enforces strict minimum square footage laws that tiny homes simply can't meet, making them illegal in most residential zones. Beyond that, many local zoning boards refuse to allow alternative housing types unless they fit into specific categories like manufactured home parks, which tiny homes rarely qualify for. Trying to build your own off-grid cabin or a small permanent dwelling triggers a cascade of inspections, permits, and bureaucratic hurdles designed for traditional houses, not innovative small spaces. And if you're thinking of tiny homes on wheels, brace yourself. They're usually classified as recreational vehicles, and living in an RV year-round is largely prohibited outside designated campgrounds or mobile home parks. Wisconsin. Wisconsin's scenic beauty and welcoming small-town vibe might make you imagine it as a tiny home paradise. But when it comes to actually living small, the state puts up some serious barriers. The biggest obstacle? The state's failure to recognize tiny homes on wheels as legitimate permanent residences. This classification automatically excludes a large segment of the tiny home community who rely on mobility and flexibility. For stationary tiny homes, the challenges only deepen. Wisconsin requires these homes to comply fully with traditional residential building codes, including mandatory foundation requirements and minimum square footage standards, often set at 800 square feet or more, well above what most tiny homes offer. Many municipalities don't even have the necessary zoning language to process tiny home applications properly, resulting in countless delays, denials, or endless back and forth with local officials. West Virginia. Last but not least, West Virginia, a state filled with natural beauty and affordable land, still manages to box out tiny homes. While there are fewer statewide zoning mandates, local regulations tend to be inconsistent and unwelcoming. Most counties classify tiny homes on wheels as temporary shelters, and permanent installations are subject to rigid housing codes that ignore the unique needs of small dwellings. There's also a general lack of infrastructure for tiny home communities, which means even if you own land, you may not legally reside there in a tiny home full-time. In West Virginia, the freedom of living small is often overshadowed by old-fashioned red tape. In West Virginia, the dream of living small runs headfirst into a system still built for big, traditional homes. And unless you're ready to fight City Hall or fly under the radar, that dream might stay parked on the sidelines. If you live in one of these states, it doesn't mean your dream is dead, but it does mean you'll have to get creative, do your research, and maybe even advocate for change. What do you think? Should tiny homes be legalized nationwide? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this helpful, hit that like button, subscribe for more content on off-grid living, sustainable housing, and life beyond the blueprint. And don't forget to share this with someone who's ready to downsize and live large by going small.